Today we are going to focus, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the legal structures around these opportunities as you expand your brand into new markets. There's a lot to think about. I think a lot of companies would look at that and say, you know, I just want to get my IP into these markets, but there's a lot more things that need to be dealt with in terms of contracts and structural alignment, and even your corporate hygiene and corporate infrastructure as you plot your brand expansion strategy. So today we have with us Sander Zagzewski, who is the co-chair of the Clark Hill PLC cannabis practice. Sander's been in the industry in cannabis for over 6 years and has a lot of transactional experience. So Sander, please come on in and join the event, and we'll dive in.
Thanks, Eric and Robin. Thanks to our presenters. This is a timely discussion. Appreciate you inviting me to join.
Well, great. Sander, give us a little bit background on you and the firm, real quick. We'll
Sure.
just kick everything off.
So Clark Hill's a national law firm, about 700 lawyers. We're headquartered in the Midwest. We are, a full-service AmLaw ranked law firm. So, there are very few substantive practice areas that we don't have covered in the firm. Our cannabis industry group, it represents, we have about 50 lawyers in our firm that are active in the cannabis industry group. And that's 50 lawyers that devote a meaningful percentage of their time to the industry. My co-chair is Bob Hoban, who is also the member in charge of our Denver office. If you've been in the cannabis industry for more than a few minutes, you've probably run across Bob or some of his work. Bob has been in the cannabis industry, I think, for 14, 15 years, something like that. He's one of the original Colorado cannabis lawyers. He built up a very nice law firm, the Hoban Law Group, which Clark Hill acquired middle of last year. And so Bob and I have been co-chairing this practice since he joined the firm. Our cannabis industry group really is a multidisciplinary practice group. I mean, all of the major substantive practice areas in our firm are represented, not just capital markets, M&A, and the corporate side, which is what I do, but and Bob as well, but certainly the licensing side. But we have tax lawyers in our group. We have real estate lawyers in our group, intellectual property lawyers, which is certainly something we'll be talking about today. We have litigators. We have white-collar crime lawyers. We really have the gamut. So what we try to do a little bit differently than some of our friendly competitors is to integrate all of those practice areas at the partner level to make sure that everybody is everybody involved in the industry is talking to each other in a way that allows us collectively to kind of raise the bar in terms of the skill sets and the work product that we provide to our clients. And so, we're pretty proud of what we've accomplished. We had a great year this year, even though the industry itself has been somewhat struggling. And we're looking forward to a robust 2023.
Aren't we all?
Yes, we are.
So that's great. Appreciate the intro. I think what we're going to dive in here, everybody kind of knows that there's 3 approaches to go into new markets, right? You can take the
Sure.
asset light approach where you just license your intellectual property and really sit back and hopefully collect mailbox checks to some degree. There's the asset heavy where you actually go into a market, you acquire a license, and you become the operator. And so you're all in and manufacturing, vertical integration. The model that is probably the most common is what we'll call the hybrid approach, which tends towards asset light because not everybody has the bandwidth and the wherewithal and the capital to move in and acquire new licenses, but it's an asset light plus, let's call it, right? So asset light approach, but you're also taking on a number of other, needs in terms of launching your brand. You're taking over sales and marketing. You may be dealing with all your packaging. You've got headcount in those markets. If you're a vape company, maybe you've got some hardware. So there's a lot of different ways to add value to an asset light approach by going through this IP based. And we're going to talk a lot about that. What I find is so interesting is that when you talk to a lot of brands that are going into a new market, you ask them, what is your intellectual property strategy? What is your IP strategy? What do how are you setting yourself up with this strategy? And some of that might be, different entities holding the different IP. And I think a lot of companies say, well, I haven't really contemplated that. I don't have an IP strategy. Can you start, Sander, with kind of sharing with, what are the components of developing an IP strategy? Where do you start, and how do you kind of roll that out?
Sure. And that's a good question. And, the cannabis industry has moved so fast and grown so rapidly, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of us are looking at it and thinking, wow, things are moving quite slowly the last year and a half. But the industry as a whole has grown in leaps and bounds. And so a lot of people really haven't given much thought to kind of an integrated strategy on how they grow their IP. But if you take a step back and pull yourself out of the cannabis industry and just look at this from kind of a basic business perspective, your intellectual property is one of your core assets, if not your core asset in this type of product. I mean, the plants come and go, right? You can operate with different distributors. You can even operate with different people, but the stuff you're building as a cannabis brand is typically that brand, right? Or your suite of brands or your suite of products. And so thinking about what your brand is going to be, how you're going to protect it, how you're going to differentiate it from your competitors' brands, and how you're going to exploit that brand in new markets is crucially important. But a lot of folks have sort of done it by accident, right? They sort of responded to opportunities as they come, as opposed to thinking from, I'm at point A, I want to get to point B, what's the best path? And so when you talk about a strategy, some strategies, for example, are very, very constrained. Hey, I've got to own it. I've got to own all the production. I've got to control everything. I want it registered. I want to be very, very key. I don't want any outside risks with respect to my strategy. So, some people are very open. I'm okay with licensing. I want to hit as many jurisdictions as I can as fast as I can. Some people are careful to register their IP. Some people are more careful to protect it from a trade secrets perspective, right? You think about the formula of Coca-Cola, for example, right? That's a kind of your quintessential trade secret, and everybody talks about it. So we could spend hours going through possibilities, but when you sit around as a brand, you need to recognize the value of that brand and separate intellectually that brand from all the other stuff from the product that the brand label is sitting on, and think, okay, how do I protect that brand? But then how do I exploit it? How do I make that brand valuable in and of itself? And that's what a strategy really gets to, I think.
Yeah. So there's really, when you think about IP, people tend to think about two pieces of it, right? It's, I need to protect my IP and I need to monetize my IP, right?
Right.
But how does that often dovetail into your corporate structure in terms of having, multiple entities and housing your IP in one entity? Or, how do you, what do you recommend when people are coming to you with an IP licensing strategy on how to kind of isolate various assets that you have, asset classes, your IP in a holding co structure? I mean, I think we all know there's a lot of brands out there that have multiple entities. And that can be a problem with your corporate hygiene if you don't manage all that properly. So any kind of best practices in terms of how to think through your corporate structure. Again, every situation is unique and distinct, so there's no blanket answer to that. But like, what are the things that you should be thinking about as you develop that strategy?
Well, and by the way, let me qualify one thing, that everything we're talking here, nothing here is legal advice. This is just for informational purposes only. Two guys chatting. But I would take this opportunity to say, when you're talking about intellectual property, it is something where you are going to want to have actual legal advice, talk to an IP lawyer to think it through with you, because the moves you make can have consequences, some of which are unintended. But what I've seen as a very typical structure that seems to make a lot of sense for folks for a variety of reasons is to try to house as much of their IP as possible in an affiliate entity, usually rolling up to a holding company, but an entity that is distinct from its cannabis license holder entity. And by the way, we're going to say the word license, and it has two meanings, right? There's license, which is your cannabis license, which is the government giving you permission to cultivate and manufacture and sell weed. There's also license in the IP sense, which is I have property and I license to you the right to use it. That's a contractual thing between private parties. And so hopefully that's not too confusing. But when you have your license holder entity, the one that actually touches plant, that entity is undoubtedly subject to 280E, and we're going to talk about that more later. But that's an entity which, because of 280E, can only deduct its cost of goods sold. An intellectual property holding entity, however, at least arguably, and depending on how you set things up, again, you will want some real tax lawyers to be involved in this as well. But that entity should be able to deduct its ordinary business expenses. And so if you structure things properly, an IP company, which may also do some other promotional things, that company could potentially help you on the tax side. And then from an IP, just forget about the tax for a minute, having a company that can license that intellectual property both inside your corporate structure. In other words, it licenses your IP to your own wholly owned companies that actually cultivate, manufacture, distribute, and sell weed, or externally license it to third parties, which is principally what we're talking about today. That entity, you will probably find that to be a very clean way to house that IP in your corporate tree. And why would you do that, by the way? You would do it for a whole lot of reasons, but primarily to keep things clean from a corporate perspective and an accounting perspective and a tax perspective, right? Having IP in a separate affiliate from your actual plant touching entities and potentially other entities might be advisable. Now, you may find other entities as well that, the more complicated, if you're an MSO, you probably are going to have a bunch of different entities, and you may not be able to house all of your IP in the same entity because of an acquisition you did or something like that. So again, it's not going to always be clean, but that's probably, that would be the goal, I think, for most companies, is to keep that IP in one place if they can.
Is it, a lot of people are in this industry to kind of grow something, and maybe they want to go public, or maybe someday they want to be acquired. In an acquisition, that IP entity, that portfolio of assets is absolutely critical in getting a deal done. Arguably the most important thing that outside of human capital, that IP is probably, top two in terms of what a buyer may, or, an IPO would be looking at in terms of justifying a valuation. Is it absolutely critical to keep it separate from other operating entities, or can you commingle? Like, what are the pros and cons? Is it just something you want it to be separate and distinct and set aside, and it's perfectly, like, again, corporate hygiene? And does that
Sure.
eliminate risk of the deal, not being, there might be some other assets that doesn't have as perfect corporate hygiene that could, derail some discussions? But what are the key factors in determining, the IP structure or the IP holding entity that might fold up into the holding company?
The real key about IP is making sure you have clean ownership or right to use that IP. So does it have to be in a separate company? No. But if you're in an IPO or you're in a major acquisition, a significant amount of the due diligence effort is going to be looking at IP, all the way starting from its creation. So in other words, have your founders actually contributed their personal ownership rights in the intellectual property into the company? A lot of people forget to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so
No,
now
same.
you have some ambiguity as to whether the company even started as an owner of this intellectual property. You know, work for hire type agreements. You know, when you have people working on intellectual property and they are not employees of the business, and sometimes this happens, particularly at the early stages, then they are not presumed to be operating as a work for hire on behalf of the company, and they personally have potentially at least some rights to that intellectual property. And so you really cleaning that up is most important. Having it in an IP affiliate is, again, one strategy. It's a very nice strategy because it just gives you a hub and spoke model. Here's my IP. I license it internally. I license it externally, and you can have it can be, if you do it properly, it's very clean. It's an easy folder in a data room to show to your underwriters council or to your acquirers council, and everybody's happy. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. You just need to know if you don't hold it there, you need to hold it someplace, right? It may be at the parent company level as a holding company. It might be owned by the license holder. In this context, license holder meaning the plant touching companies. But it has to be held someplace, and it should be clean. Not you want to, because again, as a buyer or an underwriter in an offering, they just care to know that number one, that you have the right to use it, and number two, it's not going to be taken from you. It's not infringing on some third party. You're not going to get involved in a lawsuit related to your IP sometime down the line that they're going to end up having to pay for.
Yeah, no, great advice, great advice. I think the one thing I hear from most brands that are entering new markets is they're terrified that their IP is going to be stolen from them, or they're going to teach somebody how to make the perfect gummy, or whatever the form factor is, that, you know, that they're worried that you find a co-packer, you teach them how to make your product, and all of a sudden there's 5 other products in the market from the same co-packer that you might believe you help them educate on how to do that. You know, so there's trade secrets, there's trademarks, but how worried should people be about a partnership with any type of with another brand or a license holder in a new market around this concept of IP infringement?
It's a good question, and it really depends on 2 things. Number one, it depends on, you know, how much attention you actually paid to the deal you struck with those folks, and number 2, you know, who are these folks? So, you know, it used to be almost common knowledge that whenever a big American manufacturer decided to have a Chinese factory manufacture a bunch of their products, you know, the first 2 shifts of the factory would go to the people that actually ordered it, right? The Levi's or whoever and then the 3rd shift was all the knockoffs, and it was the same stuff using the same machinery, and that was sold into the infringing market, and people kind of accepted or didn't, but there wasn't much that the brand companies could do about it. Thankfully, you know, we're not talking about that sort of a situation. We're talking about, let's say, a California brand going into a different state through a licensing model. So how worried should folks be? Well, again, it depends. It depends on what might happen. So in other words, are you worried about teaching somebody how to make the perfect gummy? Well, your actual intellectual property, your formulations, those sorts of things, you can contractually protect those. And so, assuming you pay attention to the documents you put together, I wouldn't lose a ton of sleep over that. You will probably end up teaching people how to be much better at their job. To the extent that it's a trade secret, you're gonna give somebody the secret sauce, the formula for Coke, whatever it is. You can try to protect trade secrets. Trade secrets are protectable. But if all you're teaching somebody how to do is to be really good at what they do, but it's really, you know, there's nothing protectable about it, well, guess what? You're probably not going to, you very likely will build, if not a competitor, somebody, you will help somebody else build their business in the cannabis industry. I guess the bigger question though is, what really are you worried about? In other words, okay, you have a co-packer that works with you, and they get particularly good at working with you. That may be a company you want to acquire when the capital markets comes back and you can raise the money to do so, right? Or the M&A market that usually follows from the strength of the capital markets. Or maybe again, maybe it's a long-term joint venture or strategic alliance that you would want to continue. And so I think it's worth worrying about, but there are a bunch of things that you can do and negotiate if you're patient to not only protect yourself, but maybe allow yourself to take advantage of all the teaching that you're doing to that business, right? And you can talk about exclusivity. You can talk about requirements contracts, right? I mean, when we're dealing with this sort of a hybrid, as you talk about, the asset light on one side, asset heavy on the other, most of these deals are somewhere in the middle. So all of the conversation really should be around these issues that you're talking about. In other words, okay, I'm going to devote a lot of time and attention, maybe even some money, into helping my partner in this other state develop her business. What do I want in return? Well, presumably you want exclusivity for some period of time. You also want to think through very carefully, how do I know that, I'm putting in all this time, attention, and money. Am I getting priority in terms of product delivery? What happens when, everybody else figures out how good she is, so they start trying to hire her as well? So do I get priority? What if she can't fill my orders even with priority? What if my brand is so damn good that I need a second supplier? Am I going to be able to do that? And do I give her the opportunity to step up and fill those orders? Vice versa, by the way. Let's say you're on the other side. Are you going to give those commitments of priority, exclusivity? If you're going to be if you're on the other side of this branding deal, a big California brand wants to come into your state, that's great. Presumably they're going to expect you to be exclusive. They're going to want to be your priority customer. Are you going to make sure that they get their requirements from you versus going elsewhere for it? And so those are going to be the negotiated terms. When it comes to stuff like trade secrets, I would both expect I would expect both sides to agree to very strict confidentiality provisions. That would be the norm, and particularly insofar as trade secrets are involved, but also as far as any intellectual property, intangible, there really is no good reason to say no to a very strict confidentiality agreement in this context. And so I think that would be the norm. And that's, by the way, probably your primary method of protecting your intellectual property in the cannabis space. That was a short answer. You want the long one?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it does seem that in general, this is an issue that every industry, CPG industry in the world has had to deal with this. Cannabis, I think what's interesting about cannabis is that there is a lot of expertise. There's a lot of it, there's 3 different types of extraction, and there's all sorts of different expertise here and there that have been learned over the years. And I think, some people are very wary of telling anybody what those secrets are. If you're someone who wants, is really worried about that and doesn't want to do a deal with, let alone an MSO, but even someone, the only recourse ultimately is what, right? I mean, you're watching, you're hovering, you're making sure you get the perfect deal, but you want your partner to be successful too. So it's a catch-22 sometimes. I mean, The MSOs are intimidating because they have all sorts of different, documents that they'll use to protect their interests. And sometimes you don't want to teach them how to do a solventless extraction technique. Anyway, long story short is that I hear people say, I feel like I'm deer in the headlights. I'm so worried about protecting my IP that someone's going to take it. And I guess I kind of look at that and I say, well, A, you need good legal advice, but B, more importantly, at the end of the day, what are you really worried about? Like, there's a lot of people out there with a lot of, brain power and understanding on how to do the different areas. I mean, whether that's indoor cultivation, there's a lot of, brains out there that are doing innovative, approaches to whatever that segment is. Do you feel like people maybe over obsess on it a little, or is there, because it just seems like the old saying is, unless your IP is only good as the balance sheet to protect it, right? Where you're going to have to
Sure.
start suing people all over the place, which, trust me, is a long road to haul and fraught with risk in and of itself. But how do you kind of respond to somebody that's so worried like this? What do you do to alleviate that concern?
Well, it really depends on where the fear is coming from, right? Because a lot of people are perhaps more afraid than they should be, right? Again, like you said, there's a lot of smart people out there in this industry, and you'd be pretty arrogant to think you're the only smart person in the industry, and that everybody needs to steal whatever's in your head or your experience. So a lot of people do obsess more than is necessary, which isn't to say that there aren't people out there willing to pick your pocket in the cannabis industry. I mean, just like any other industry, sure, it's hard, and like you say, if you don't have the money to protect your IP, then people can steal it. What I would say though is, again, anytime you're picking your partners, you need to find people that are trustworthy. You need to pay attention to the terms, and then you have to think through: is it worth the risk of somebody learning my trade secrets or learning my IP and making small enough adjustments to them that I probably can't sue them if they start to copy me? And but is it worth that risk in order to get into a new market and expand my brand and expand my business, right? I mean, if you sit there in fear for too long, then you go nowhere. You're stuck, right? So the alternative isn't if most people in business, the alternative of doing nothing isn't realistic for very long.
Yeah.
So if you can tread water or you can swim somewhere. So where are you going to go? And usually you want to find a partner. So I think it's really, I mean, that's the best answer I can come up with. But really, again, it does come down a lot to what is your actual IP? How valuable is it? How likely is it to be stolen? And that you have to sort of just step back and do some soul searching. Am I really that good? Is this really so unique that people are going to risk being sued by me down the line or to steal it versus developing something on their own?
Great advice. So let's talk a little bit about deal terms.
Sure.
One of the things we see when somebody, you obviously have clients that come to you and they could have a fully baked agreement with somebody in terms of the commercial terms, or you can have somebody that says, look, I'm talking with this guy, I need a licensing agreement. We've certainly seen that one of the big challenges in the front part of this is getting alignment on what's the total addressable market, how much revenue am I going to do in your market, and having those discussions early on with your prospect partner or a couple of different, and really develop a business plan. Because I think so much of the challenges in cannabis are non-alignment of interests and expectations that aren't met, right? So we'll talk a little bit about deal terms in terms of like dispute resolution and things like that. But you've got this conceptually, you've got let's just call it a joint partnership agreement, of which marketing is going to be a critical part of that. And royalties are driven by, what your contributions are. If you're not contributing anything, you get a lower value royalty. And if you're bringing in your own hardware, your own people, your own sales and marketing, all these things, you're looking for a higher royalty. When you look at these, the kind of at the high level, and kind of this dovetails into what you said before about exclusivity, how do you prioritize and how do you think about, on behalf of your clients, before there's a signed deal, what are you trying to achieve with the deal? Are you trying to do 20 different what if scenarios? Are you trying to contemplate every possible thing that could go wrong and try to jam all that into agreement? How are we going to have this dispute resolved? Or, how much detail do you go into the deal itself? Is this a 50-page document? Is it or is it a one-page document? What are your thoughts in terms of, putting the actual terms of the deals together and how comprehensive that needs to be?
Well, I wouldn't make a living on one-page documents for very long, right? So I promise you it won't be one page. And that isn't just a joke. Truth be told, a deal like this, there are a lot of moving parts. If you can figure out how to do it on a one-page document, great. But you aren't likely to get a document that's satisfactory to either side. The truth is there's a lot going on, and so it's probably a lot closer to the 50 than the one. I don't think it needs to be a 50-page document in most cases, but you have to address a lot of things. So like you've talked about, you got to address sales and marketing, right? You have to address exclusivity. You have to address timings, and one of the issues that you see come up a lot is if I'm the producer, let's call it a white labeling deal for lack of a better word. I need to create a whole bunch of product for you as the brand, but what if that product doesn't sell? I'm building your mousetrap, but if it doesn't sell, I own it. I've presumably taken some risk. Now, and again, we haven't talked. There will be financial terms. Are you giving me any money, or am I doing this all in my own nickel? And what are the payment terms? When it comes to royalties and that sort of thing. So, if I'm taking on this risk, if it doesn't sell, am I allowed to sell it to third parties? What do I do with this product? And again, what if it's a huge success and I can't meet the demand? But I've taken on all this risk. I want the opportunity to meet that demand before you go to a third party. Are you gonna be the one to give me prediction on deal flow volumes, right? So that I can plan my business, or am I going to have to just take that risk on myself? So all of these issues need to be run through. And again, what's the term? Now, you as a license, the IP licensor, are you going to expect some sort of guarantees? Are you going to expect some sort of minimums? Are you going to expect me to meet quality standards? By the way, one of the reasons I say this really is unlikely to be a one-page document is in order to have a true IP license, you do need to make sure that you are protecting the IP. For you to own it, and for you to keep that IP protected, you need to take reasonable steps to protect it. One of the things you have to do in order to do that is put reasonable contractual restrictions on me as the licensee of your IP to meet your specifications. So you can't just say, okay, here's a license, Sander, go and run with it in your state. That's going to be problematic, not just for me, but for you, because you're the IP owner and you need to protect your IP and you need to restrict me and make sure that I'm doing it properly. Otherwise, somebody who's trying to challenge your IP in your home state could potentially look at that and say, look, you're not really protecting your IP. So you have to build in a whole bunch of protections into that agreement to make sure that the intellectual property is being treated with respect, for lack of a better word. So those provisions are going to go in there. You're going to you're going to talk about quality control. You're going to be. I mean, again, there's a whole long list. audit rights, for example. Let's say, anytime parties contract, and presumably your royalty is going to be based on a percentage of something, or even if it's not a percentage, it'll be a bunch of, if sales are between A and B, you're going to pay me X. If it's between B and C, you're going to pay me Y. If it's between C and D, you're going to pay me, Z, whatever it is. So whenever you have those sorts of contractual provisions, you need to have the discussion about auditing sales and auditing results. You're going to care about it as the person receiving the royalty, and I'm of course going to care about it because I'm the one who has to pay you. So all of those terms do unfortunately make for a complex agreement. It is unlikely that you're going to do something like this with just some bullet points, because the likelihood for misunderstanding is great. Another thing you will want to think about when it comes to intellectual property is who has the responsibility to protect it in that jurisdiction, in that state. In other words, somebody is knocking off my product, but it's your brand in my state. Who has to sue? Are you suing or am I suing? And who's paying for that, right? And so that also needs to be fleshed out. Just the term of the license, by the way, we need to talk. How long is this commitment? And are you going to? Do we have extensions built in? Things like that. I mean, if it's going great, if it's going very well, most of my business might be your brand, and I'm going to want to keep this going for a while, right?
Right.
But you might have a different motivation. Do you have the right to terminate? Let's say an MSO comes along down the line with the ability to produce your product in my state. Are you going to be allowed to terminate your license agreement with me in order to sell to this MSO and shift the business you have with me to that MSO in my state, right? So those are all of those provisions. And again, by the way, you also likely will have in both directions. What if people aren't performing in a satisfactory way, right? I'm consistently producing product with your brand on it that is not meeting the quality expectations that you have for your brand, or vice versa, right? I'm producing great stuff and you're not supporting me in the way you've promised. You're not giving me the sales and marketing support, the social media that you promised. And so I'm sitting here with great product and it's not moving as fast as I expected it to move, or that it should move. And so all of these things do need to be addressed. So the downside about these deals is it requires you to think about a lot of things that you may not necessarily have to think about, at least in the beginning, if you're doing an M&A transaction or a capital markets transaction, right? Because you have to actually think through the machinery of the business, what's happening, and I'll hit the pause button here, but hopefully that kind of answers the question. If it's done properly, it likely is a reasonably lengthy, 20 to 30 page agreement with a lot of moving parts. But if done properly, these types of relationships can be they can be mutually beneficial, right? Yeah. Because in both contexts, let's take a step back. Why are we even talking about this, right? We're talking about this because you've got a brand. You don't want to come into my state and acquire me or buy my license. You may not have the cash, or if you do, you certainly don't want to give it to me right now. And this is a way for people to expand their businesses and share risk and reward. So that's really it, right? We're sharing the risk and reward. I'm taking on risk, you're taking on risk, and we're splitting the upside. And so how we share risk, how we allocate responsibility for all these tasks should go into that document. Yeah. If not, we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure.
No, there's no question. I mean, there's no doubt that these are all, many of them fall into these what if scenarios. What happens if you can't, the
Hmm.
supply chain breaks down? What happens if, there's a recall for a packaging design problem on, whatever. I think one of the things that we've seen that works really well is when somebody goes into these discussions with a pretty comprehensive understanding of what their agreement is going to look like, so that they can say, okay, I don't need to send you a 20, 30-page document after our first meeting, but there's now a process that we can use the document and what it talks about to, what it will kind of memorialize some discussions that you and I are having right now about, okay, let's start with total addressable market. What are your expectations for my sales? How did you get there? And then kind of drop down as you go through, all these different sequences, is have a commercial discussion. And I think that works if you're a vape brand in California and you want to go to Massachusetts. So there's a lot of information that you have based on your historical precedent of solving problems with whatever it may be, and how you can help your partner in Massachusetts do that. Where it gets a little harder is all these big markets that are opening up, where you have varying degrees of competency from prospect partners in New York and Pennsylvania. I mean, there's some medical, of course, but there's just, the person you're speaking with, the truth of the matter is they're going to give their best efforts. They're going to do everything they can. They want you to succeed. They want to succeed, and they want to have a great partnership. But there's going to be a lot that you cannot be 100% sure of. And I think that
Hmm.
that is kind of how you behave in the initial conversations with those, in those partnership discussions of, hey, let's just put it all on the table. You tell me how you operate. I'll tell you how I operate. And let's make sure that we've got a framework to discuss, that we're almost practicing dispute management right now, where we realize, oh,
Sure.
we're not aligned on that, or you do it differently. That's okay. I got my arms around it, but now we have to memorialize that in a contract. So kind of almost like a checklist. Like, all right, these are the things we need to talk about. I I don't want to just pass it to my lawyer, right? I want them to ultimately have be able to say, here's what you do. Here's what we want to see in this agreement. But I think, having an understanding of the entirety of the agreement is just a professional approach on how to build the relationship with in the partnership, that, as sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, we'll have some growing pains.
Oh, undoubtedly true. And by the way, I would strongly encourage people to, don't get scared off of these, because I said that it'll be a long document at the end of the day. It may be a collection of documents too, by the way. It doesn't have to be, the length of the document will probably be sort of, will be very similar to the party's collective financial commitment in terms of money and time, right? So in other words, you might be a brand new license holder, in a new state that's coming legal, and I just come in and say, look, let's try something out, right? I'll devote some time and attention to you. I'll teach you how to make my product. You're gonna, you may just be getting started, so you may have never actually cultivated weed legally in that state because you just got your license, right? So we're going to go start this out together. In that context, yeah, you're probably not going to have a 30-page agreement. You'll have the license terms, but you'll also have some pretty generous outs on both sides if it doesn't work. So because the commitment is minimal, if you will. I'm going to come in with my team. We're going to help you set up. There might be there'll be some money, but some help, but you're taking your risk, I'm taking mine, right? The longer the term, if you're doing long term, big volumes, and if I'm going to require you to devote a bunch of your facility just to my product, because I know I'm going to sell this stuff, I'm going to make it's going to be a proprietary strains. So I'm not going to let you sell that to anybody else. It's mine. I need to be exclusive. I need you to be my first priority. I want to make sure that I have some approval over, who's actually touching my plant. So if you have employees and I don't like those folks, I want to be able to tell you, look, get them away from my stuff. So I'm going to have a high degree of control, and in return, I'm going to put a bunch of money into it. I'm doing marketing. I'm doing so. In that context, you know what? It's probably a longer agreement, but also you're probably going to be okay with it. Again, if the financial terms are correct, the length is probably going to be okay. And so I think that's kind of where you go. You're not going to get away from some amount of legalese simply because you have an intellectual property license. You're going to have to deal with infringement. You're going to have to deal with specifications. You're going to have to deal with the minimal, reasonable protection of that IP, so that both sides know that we're not giving a third party a wedge into, into devaluing the IP for either of us. But the greater the commitment, probably the longer it's going to be. But again, that would be appropriate, and both sides will probably, even if you hate signing long contracts, they'll probably get there anyway, just as you just go through the checklist of items you mentioned, Eric, and start to realize, yeah, there's a few things we could document.
No doubt. No doubt. Reminder, we were happy to answer any questions you have from the audience. Sanders here, and please take advantage of that opportunity. So put your questions in. Before we get to some of those questions, I do want to just touch on this dispute, relationship management issue. It's one thing, to have obviously a breach, right, where somebody, is clearly in breach of the contract. But there's a lot more nuance to this. And so one of the major things that we see a lot is a change of control provision in these agreements, such that if you are acquired by somebody, that at least gives me the option to get out, or there's a lot of different contexts for that. But a lot of people are really worried that, like, okay, I'm using I'm partnering with another brand, and that brand gets acquired by another big brand that's a competitor of mine. And there's a lot of anxiety around that potential. And sometimes that anxiety is not predicated on anything, but certainly there's an X%, single-digit % chance your partner gets acquired, or you get you get acquired by somebody that has a co-packing facility, and they need to extract you from that relationship. That's why they're buying you, right? So how do you kind of deal with these change of control provisions? And those are some pretty important mechanics on, like, oh, I just got bought, and like, oh, well, you got bought by somebody that was actually trying to compete with me, right? And so there's all these, things that go on. What are your thoughts on, in general, how to kind of treat these situations?
Yeah, I mean, those are very good points, and both of them are situations where you typically would have some period of notice, but I think in both contexts, unless the agreement is so one-sided that you can have one side effectively block a change of control transaction, assuming both sides are going to have the freedom to buy and sell their businesses as they see fit. I think you will want to have the ability, with some notice, to let people get out. Now, the notice provisions might need to be rather lengthy, right? Again, if I'm going to have to replace you and you're really my partner in a particular state, I might need 6 months, right? I might need or longer. I mean, might need a long time to do that. But those are all good points, right? In other words, you may be my partner in this state, and I don't want you to sell to my competitor and to another MSO. And again, you may not want me. You may have an issue with me if I'm, let's say I'm a California brand, and it's less likely to be your concern as the one jurisdiction, but you might sell to a large MSO, and I stay a California brand, right? And I want to sell to somebody who's now a major competitor of yours, right? So these things are possible, and you'll want to address them. A couple things to also talk about, because we talked about them in preparing for the call, but intellectual property all of the, when it comes to things like specifications, you're going to care that that I actually present your brand the way you want it presented, right? Let's say you're the brand company. I keep switching our roles, by the way, so I apologize. Hopefully people are following that. But you're going to care that I properly present your brand. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that's actually important just from an intellectual IP law perspective. One way you might be able to get creative, though, is when it comes to things like 280E. We all know that 280E is that your plant touching entities can only deduct their cost of goods sold. But you might find it necessary in order to protect your intellectual property to require me just to buy my packaging from you, the branding company, right? And the cost of that packaging, assuming it's reasonable, is that should be cost of goods sold for me as the plant touching company. And so part of what you can do in these deals is do a little bit of 280E planning, a little bit of 280E structuring to make sure both parties are benefiting in a way which helps them rather than hurts them from a 280E perspective. I wouldn't say that this is the best way to deal with 280E, but it's certainly a way that you can start, thinking about your 280E planning in the context of these sorts of transactions.
So if structured properly, there is a potential for both companies in the partnership, the license provider and the IP licensor, to benefit from a COGS model that allow them both to write off a lot. So if I make gummies and we're going to sell them for $10 wholesale and I'm going to make a 10% royalty, I can sell you my packaging for $1 and you buy it from me, and that kind of takes into account all of the IP license, but it's framed as the purchase of packaging. Is that kind of how that might work? I mean, again, I know there's 1,000 different examples, but just conceptually, are we trying to get to a point where both companies have the benefit here?
So that's probably too extreme. So again, 280E is one of those areas where, again, I will caution you, make sure you get good 280E advice, because 280E, as we all know, can really hurt people if they do it incorrectly. But here's the point, right? So if you are the intellectual property holder, and instead of charging me a royalty, you sell me super inflated packaging, and I buy it from you, and I deduct the entirety of that packaging as cost of goods sold. That's creative and clever, but probably too clever, and that'll probably be something the IRS would attack, right? The IRS, so everything you do in this context needs to be viewed from the lens of, is it going to pass? In law school, we used to call it the smell test, right? You're gonna give it a little sniff. If it doesn't smell right, you're not going to drink it. And are you going to be able to defend this to the IRS if you have a 280E audit? So I wouldn't say eliminate your royalty and put it all into the packaging, but within reason, you might be able to get away with leaning on it one way or the other, right? The royalty payment, which is probably an ordinary business expense, it's not part of your cost of goods sold, but the IRS is going to expect a royalty payment when they see an intellectual property license. So if that number is 0, you're basically setting yourself up to get whacked. So, they're going to expect a reasonable royalty, but can you increase packaging a little bit and lower royalty a little bit? Again, I would defer to your 280E advisors, but I would say it may be possible to lean on one versus the other a little bit and help yourself. In 280E, just as an aside, 280E is problematic for the whole industry, has been from its inception. And one way you can really quickly figure out if you have a problem is how how perfect is the outcome, right? If people magically eliminate their 280E exposure, I promise you it's not going to work. So everybody has to take a little bit of pain with 280E, and
Right.
if you're too clever, it's problematic. So definitely don't go there with it. But what I'm saying is, when you're in these sorts of arrangements, you have one company, the company that holds the intellectual property and isn't presumably a plant touching company, so at least arguably is allowed to deduct its ordinary business expenses. The more expenses you can put on that entity in this relationship, the better, right?
Yeah.
And to the extent that the plant touching entity, which we all know is subject to 280E, can then can take on more risk, that is, can properly characterize as cost of goods sold, then that is beneficial again for it when it comes to tax reporting. I won't get into more detail though, because again, very specific as to both companies, the relationship, the business risk, etc.
Great. Well, we are already through an hour. We could probably sit here for another hour, but Sander, thank
you and I
so
can talk forever, Eric.